This week on Geek-A-Rati, I'm interviewing Jason Vey about his new role-playing game, Wasted Lands. It's a role-playing game set in a primordial world that's about how the ancient gods of mythology came to be. If you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. I really enjoy doing these, but I want to build some audience. Please enjoy the interview.
Hello and welcome to Geek-A-Rati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life and love of the earth. Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
Hello and welcome to Geek-A-Rati. This is your host, Christian Lindke, and I'm joined here today by game designer Jason Vey, and we're here to discuss his new and upcoming game project, Wasted Lands, which will be up on Kickstarter in the near future, but is well into development and playtesting even as we speak. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start right away with just asking about Wasted Lands, then we'll go back and talk about some of your history as a game designer, but I don't want to do the build-up first. I want to jump into this product because I think it's really an interesting game concept, and I just want the audience to know I am not a part of the playtest. All I've seen is what he's been blogging about. I am, as you can see looking behind me, I am someone who's purchased other games that Jason has made, but I have no deep insider information on this. So, Jason, what is Wasted Lands?
So I've actually talked about this so much lately that I get confused myself now when I'm trying to outline it. But basically, the premise is, as most people are aware, about 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. It didn't just wipe out the dinosaurs. It also shifted the Earth, and it drove the great old ones of H.P. Lovecraft fame into their eternal slumber. At that point in time, there was a species that called itself human, but was actually sort of a proto-human species that the great old ones created as a servitor race. Those early proto-humans then took over all of the cities and nations and regions that the old ones left behind, spread out over the earth and took it over to create a primitive, lost, savage epoch of the world. Some of those early proto-humans had names like Thor, or Isis, or Bel, or Quetzalcoatl, or Tiamat, and those people would go on to have legendary exploits that would filter down through millions of years, through ancestral memories, and become the origins of the deities of old, the Norse mythology, Greeks, Babylonian, Aztec, Mayan. All of those myths came from these early humans who were just people, and you actually play those people. So you'll play Thor, but he'll be entirely human, not a god at all. However, as you play Ogun, or whichever one of these deities you choose to play, as you play through their life, and you interact in meaningful ways with their mythology or mythology of similar deities from other cultures, you gain what are called divine touchstones. Divine touchstones are special powers that you get that kind of represent your path to apotheosis.
So I'm seeing so many influences in this world design, both from the kind of core Appendix N fiction that inspired original D&D, but also from the kind of shamanistic spiritualism of Greg Stafford when he designed RuneQuest and things like that, in that you're finding a good foundation in rich source material, but also, I think, maybe for the first time, or at least in one of the relative few times I've ever seen, providing a narrative reason for the player characters to gain the vast amounts of power that characters often gain in role-playing games.
Yeah, I mean, as far as RuneQuest goes, I'm going to be honest, I've never actually played RuneQuest. I've
Sure.
played enough BRP, Call of Cthulhu, over the years. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. My roots are very much in the Appendix N stuff. Robert E. Howard is probably my all-time favorite writer.
Yeah.
I've read a ton of H.P. Lovecraft, and This setting is very much a Howardian sword and sorcery setting with a heavy amount of Yog-Sothothery leveled on top of it.
I was thinking about like the origins of the role-playing game hobby and going like a little bit before into the war games that influenced them. And you have one of the first kind of proto role-playing games was the Hyborian campaign that was run in England, where they, inspired by Robert Howard, told these tales of armies battling one another led by heroes such as Conan, etc., and recorded them week to week. And it just seems that the lost or primordial epoch kind of fantasy, which has a really rich tradition and I think a good fan base, doesn't get as much service in the marketplace by corporations who focus more on the D&D genre, right? D&D was once inspired by fantasy, but it has evolved so that it now inspires fantasy.
It has, to the point where I do have an appendix in Wasted Lands for how to use it with traditional fantasy. And if you want to play elves and dwarves and gnomes and whatnot, there's rules in there for those demi-human species. And so I definitely have that in there. I really want Wasted Lands to be something that anybody can pick up as sort of a D&D alternative.
Right.
If they're looking to try something a little bit different. Yeah, you can't get away from that influence. It's there, and gamers want to play it, so you have to give them what they want, you know.
Yeah, in my graduate studies, one of my professors, though, he said if you want to do like fresh new research, one of the things to do is to go back to the old writings, in my case in political science, to the stuff that was being written in like the 1890s, the 1920s, and see the questions they were asking that were answered and that like nobody questioned again.
Right.
And they're taken kind of for granted. And I think a lot of the fantasy tropes that you're drawing from here in Wasted Lands are rich soil for fertile campaigns and fertile ideas and gameplay. I also think, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this, that this is kind of a perfect time to release a new role-playing game with a kind of new theme in the marketplace.
Yeah, I very much think it is. I think there's a lot of people out there that are looking to expand their horizons, that are looking to see what else is out there, that are looking to try new things. And the interesting thing about O.G.R.E.S, my house system, is that it harkens all the way back to the earliest days of gaming, but it also uses those familiar mechanics in a very modern way. We like to say that we use old school mechanics with new school sensibilities with it. So we have like player agency mechanics in the form of fate points, and most of them are optional. So if you are a die-hard old school player, you don't have to use any of this stuff. We also have varying levels of grit. We have three in many different areas of the rules. We have gritty, normal, and cinematic options. And you don't have to blanket say my game is cinematic or my game is gritty. You can say I'm using, cinematic hit points but gritty saving throws. So you can kind of mix and match to really create the kind of experience you and your players want.
And I know that like in the early 2000s there was a kind of movement in the game theory community, or the GNS game design theory, to be critical of what they called fantasy heartbreakers, which were games that maybe used D&D mechanics but changed one thing. But having been a fan of yours for some time and looking at both spellcraft and swordplay as well as the Night Shift game, so both your Orcs and Ogres systems, that's not what I see going on in there. While I see attachment and influence to earlier game systems, like Chainmail, let's say, for spellcraft and swordplay, I see a lot of innovation as well. And I'd like, if you could touch on, we'll start with Ogres because that's your house system that you promote and use most in the current day. Essentially, like, what is Ogres and how does it work?
So O.G.R.E.S actually, it started as a means to sort of, there's this myth that old school versions of the world's most fantasy role-playing game, as we like to euphemistically say, there's this myth that they're somehow arcane and complicated and difficult to understand, and they're not. They're actually very, very simple, from the original version through the basic, expert, through the advanced versions. They're actually quite simple. They were new at what they were doing, so they maybe aren't quite well organized and explained. So the idea was to sort of codify those rules in a way that you look at it and sort of almost like a Rosetta Stone. You go, oh, now I get it. Now I can go back and play those old games. So to that end, we have 3 mechanics that power the O.G.R.E.S system. The first is your ability check or attribute check mechanic. I'm trying to train myself to say attribute because ability gets confusing then when I talk about class abilities. But your attribute check system, which is you're rolling a d20 and you're adding appropriate bonuses and then trying to get a 20 or better. Now, in terms of an attribute check, attribute bonuses go from -3 to +3, like they did if people were familiar with the basic expert versions of the rules. So you're going to roll a d20, you're going to add that subtract that -3 or add that, +1 to 3, whatever. Then you're going to I have tiered attributes. So we have tier 1, which is aspected, tier 2, which is normal, and tier 3, which is disadvantaged. You have 1 aspect that is set by your character class. You have 2 normal, which you choose, and then the remainders are disadvantaged. You get different bonus progressions for those. Okay. So you're going to add d20 plus your ability bonus plus whatever your aspected, normal, or disadvantaged bonus is there. From there, the final bonus is added by the GM, which is a difficulty bonus, usually from 0 to 10. So you may or may not know what that difficulty bonus is. It depends on the GM. So you're going to roll your d20, you're going to add those numbers, and try to get a 20 or better. That's what's used for most of the checks in the game, even for combat. So a low defense value, which is equivalent to AC, a low defense value is better because you're adding a smaller number to try and get 20 or better. So if your opponent has a defense value of 10, you're adding 10 to your attack roll to hit them. So that's your ability check mechanic, your attribute check mechanic. And I just explained it in detail, but in the end, it's roll a d20, add these bonuses, and try to get a 20 or better.
Yeah, but I love the way that you took THAC0, something that can confuse people, and made it easier than it ever was. Not that it was ever particularly hard.
Everybody tells me that, and it did not occur to me when I was doing that I was actually flipping THAC0 on its ear. It never actually occurred to me, but that is kind of the way it worked out. The second mechanic, though, is the class ability mechanic. So whether you're tracking an enemy, whether you're a renegade trying to climb a wall or move silently, even if you're a sorcerer casting spells in this game, you're going to roll percentile dice and try to get under your percentage chance to succeed. Those are the 2 main mechanics that players have to use. And the reason they're there is because the reason I didn't use a unified resolution system is because these 2 mechanics give you an instant benchmark as to what's going on at the table at any given time. So everybody's had that situation where your table is paying half attention to what's going on, and you ask somebody to make a roll, and half the table goes, oh, wait a second, can I make a roll too? In this case, if the person that's rolling is rolling percentile dice, you know they're doing something that's directly related to their class ability. So that's kind of the elegance behind it there.
Right.
The third mechanic is largely for the GM, and it's called the Rule of 2. In old editions of the game, this was baked into the rules but never codified. If you were trying to listen at a door and you weren't a thief, you hear something on a 1 or a 2. An elf trying to notice a secret door would notice it on a 1 or a 2. Surprise was a 1 or a 2. Anytime the GM needs to make a ruling that's not otherwise covered, and he or she needs to do it quickly, they pick a die, they roll it, and they look for a 1 or a 2. So those are the 3 mechanics that drive the O.G.R.E.S system.
And I'm really fond of that third one, the Rule of 2. I just really like that. It's just so helpful to the GM because you can set the likelihood and you just got a nice fixed parameter for it.
Yep.
So you can add random elements which make it fair, but then also have some classification whether you think it's more or less difficult to achieve. And I think it's so much nicer than sometimes the default, oh, just make an ability check for that.
Right.
Especially in cases where it might be a character class who doesn't have that ability normally and would have to be.
I should also note too that there is an idea in this. A lot of gamers in more modern games have this idea that if it's not on your character sheet, you can't do it.
Right.
That's not the case in Ogres. You can make, like, if you're not a renegade, you can try to move silently by making a dex or an agility check.
Right.
The big difference is twofold. The renegade, if they make their percentile check, they're moving absolutely silently. Everybody else, even if they make their check, there's still, however small, maybe a chance that they might get hurt. Also, if somebody with a class ability fails their check, they can still fall back on the ability check as well. So they actually get 2 chances to accomplish what they want. So the idea is just that anybody can try to move silently. It's just that the renegade with the class ability is better at it.
I think I do agree with you that a lot of people in modern gaming, and certainly when I say modern gaming, I'm talking like even post 2000 or whatever.
Yeah, me too.
Not just the newest wave of gamers. I remember I played Champions starting with 3rd edition of Champions, and when I moved to Southern California in 2000 to start graduate school, I played with a group at Caltech, and I went from playing Champions with players who, if you had the right special effect, like you had an energy blast that was fire or whatever, you could just start a fire,
right?
If you wanted to. But this group was like, no, if you don't have the 3 points in change environment, then you can't do that.
Right.
And it has to be on your sheet. And I've just never been that kind of player or DM, whether it's in role-playing games or even in Warhammer. And I guess maybe in the case of Warhammer, when it's competitive in a league, you want to make sure it's what you see is what you get.
Right.
But at home, I don't care if you bring little plastic army men and pretend that they're Bretonians.
Right.
I just want you to have a good time. And I love it when games have that kind of flexibility, and I think, your rule sets do. And I've got to say, with Spellcraft and Swordplay, one of the things that I liked about it is I've constantly been trying to figure out, like, how would you play if you first encountered the D&D rules and you read them and you're like, it says use chainmail. And you go to chainmail and you're like, what am I supposed to do here? And there have been like 3 or 4 attempts that are good to describe how to do that online. But I think the one that really captured my attention was yours. I thought you did an elegant way with that. So I'm glad that you're including that adaptation, the O.R.C.S system, as well in this. And could you touch on why you opted to use both your game systems in this?
Sure. So Spellcraft and Swordplay, for those who are unfamiliar, it does use a unified mechanic. It's 2d6 adding bonuses against the target number. And it really was created sort of by accident. So Elf Flare Games was really launched by accident. I was doing a lot of discussion and experimentation and scholarship on the ODD74 message boards, who are great people, and anybody who's a fan of original Dungeons & Dragons should look up that community. But I was doing a lot of work trying to figure out, like you said, how do you use, like, OD&D says you're supposed to use chainmail. Now, we know now that they never did. It was thrown in there to kind of sell chainmail, but they always used the D20 combat system. Still, there's a lot of people that go in there and they look at old interviews with Gary Gygax and from Dragon Magazine and from the Strategic Review and the notes that they gave and how it was supposed to work. And so I was just making a lot of notes and trying to experiment and figure out how that was supposed to work. Before I knew it, I had like 2/3 of a game written, I realized. So I figured I might as well throw it together and throw it out there as a print on demand and see what happens. And that became Spellcraft and Swordplay. So it's kind of like an alternate history. Rather than a retro clone, it's an alternate history game of what if D&D went the chainmail route instead of the D20 route. I've had a lot of fans of that game ask me repeatedly over the years, is there ever going to be a new printing, a new edition, a new presentation of it? And I've been telling them, yes, someday there will. With O.G.R.E.S being my house system now, I was starting to realize it's probably going to be a long time before I get around to doing a new Spellcraft and Swordplay. So kind of as a gift to fans of Spellcraft and Swordplay, I decided to put a Powered by Orcs chapter in Wasted Lands, which brings back that rules system. It is revised, so it could be considered a second edition of Spellcraft and Swordplay. There are no more tables for melee attacks. You don't consult a matrix anymore. Now it is 2d6 plus applicable bonuses against a target number of 14. And that system has been heavily play tested because I have been using Spellcraft and Swordplay to run an Age of Conan game for 15 years now, something like that. So everything that's in there has come out of my use in my home game. And we tweaked that target number a lot until we got it to a sweet spot that made sense. So 14, people who are statistical analysis people might look at that 14 and say that it seems a little off, but it's been worked on for years through experimentation and tweaking. And I always say that statistics and arithmetic are the beginning of game design, but there's an art to it because dice don't always play the way they're supposed to, statistically speaking. So there's kind of an art to it, and you have to find a sweet spot.
I'm getting ready to do a couple of reviews, and one of the things that I do, like when just looking at the mechanics, right, I'll do a simulation of the probabilities of the rolls against certain difficulties or whatever, and I run them as a simulation where the computer is rolling 10,000 rolls. And to be honest, I mean, I've played D&D for a long time. I don't know that, I mean, I haven't counted every roll I've ever made. I've probably made 10,000 rolls, but that's over my entire gaming lifetime that I've maybe done 20,000 times I've rolled the dice. So in reality, most players don't play a game long enough or frequently enough for the full probability distribution to matter. And really, you're setting guidelines as to what you want the game to feel like and the basic challenge level you want the players to experience.
Right, and Tim Brannon, who is my co-author on Night Shift, and we've been colleagues for many, many years. We used to write for Eden Studios together back in the day.
Right.
He has a PhD we have something like 6 PhDs. He's ridiculously intelligent and educated, but one of them is in statistics. So the O.G.R.E.S system really began with me throwing out some ideas and mechanics and him running a statistical analysis on all of it. And that's what gave us our core that started to build from there. That's how we got a solid basis from which to build. I'm not going to say that a lot of it stayed the same because the vast majority of it shifted after we actually play tested it,
Right.
But those statistics were an invaluable starting point.
It's like if you're looking at, I don't know, a painting or a photograph, like you might go to something like the rule of thirds or something like that to say, oh, it's obeying these basic rules of aesthetics. But then once that initial analysis is done, that doesn't determine whether or not it's a good photograph or a good film or whatever. There's a lot more to it that goes into it. And, you don't want it to feel, I think, too static. So that, particularly I think with the modern gamer, and this is something I will say has been happening more and more as the hobby has emerged, and that's the shift from wargaming, not that it's not still there, it is, there's still a heavy wargaming component and community in gaming, to an increase in the size of the story gaming community.
Yes.
Or story game percentage of the players. And for those players, having character agency or player agency seems to be a really vital part of the mechanics. So what are some ways that Wasted Lands and the O.G.R.E.S system engage and facilitate character agency or player agency?
We use fate points. That's the core way that we do it. And fate points are, you've seen their equivalent in games across the board, the Unisystem, cinematic Unisystem has drama points. Right. The Cortex system had story points. Actually, I think the Mongoose Conan called them fate points. In fact, they're just, you can spend a point and you get different effects. It could be adding a die to your roll. It could be actually dramatic editing of the scene, changing some details of the scene to suit your characters. It could be instantly healing some damage that you've taken because, hey, that wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was. Or, there's all different things that you can do with fate points. And again, for players and GMs who, for players and GMs who prefer a grittier game, you can issue using them and not use them at all. But they are there and they are considered a core part of the game.
I like when games include what I tend to call them dials, where you can dial the different kind of, I don't want to say difficulty because it's not a video game, but the level of grittiness in the campaign or lethality of the campaign by just manipulating little mechanics within it. And I really like it when a game includes advice on how to do that as well.
Yeah, and we do that in the O.G.R.E.S system. We have different levels of grit for different parts of the game. And you don't have to choose a blanket, my game is gritty or my game is cinematic. You can use cinematic hit points with normal healing and gritty saving throws, or whatever. You can pick and choose to really craft the way you and your table prefer to customize your gaming experience. So
now I've been, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've purchased products that you've designed from pretty early on, since at least I think about 2009. And I've noticed that at each wave of release that you do, right, coming up to the night shift, that not only has the rules writing become clearer and clearer, but also the kind of graphic design and the art that you're able to incorporate has gotten better and better and better. Who are you working with on this product for some of the illustrations and graphic design and maps and things like that?
So, to be honest, Spellcraft and Swordplay was done on Microsoft Word with public domain images that I drew from, by the time I got all the way up to Night Shift, I was teaching myself how to use an actual graphic design layout program. I was working with an actual printer who is the same printer that Trollord Games uses. So if you're familiar with their products, they're Smithsonian, they're solid. You can throw those books against a wall and they're not going to fall apart. As far as art goes, I'm a one-man operation, and Elflair Games is largely paying for itself right now, although I'm kind of hoping that Wasted Lands might boost us out of that into a more profitable area. What has improved my ability to make it look good is the wide availability of high-quality stock art from great artists who, like Brad McDevitt. I use a ton of Brad McDevitt's stuff because I think he's a fantastic artist. He's also a phenomenal guy. He's now working exclusively for Goodman Games. So unfortunately, I can't work directly with him anymore, but I still use all of his clip art critters and his stock art. I do have a stretch goal in Wasted Lands for a bigger art budget that's going to enable me to hire some actual artists, and I will reach out to some of my favorites from the stock art community to see if they're available. Mel Henning, who is doing my world map for me, she is just phenomenal. Really cool person and an amazing artist, and I'm really excited that she's doing my map for me, and I've promised her that she's going to be the first one I'll reach out to if we hit that stretch goal where I can have an art, a bigger art budget. But for now, it's a lot of stock art that I'm using. The covers I'm doing myself, really. I'm combining elements from different public domain sources and stock art sources that come with a license that allow me to modify and shift and change, and I'm kind of photoshopping elements together to create. That's how the Night Shift cover was created. That's how the Volume 1 role-playing game rules of Wasted Lands were created. So that's how I'm doing the covers right now, and I kind of dig the aesthetic I'm getting out of it, and a lot of my fans seem to like it, so I may continue to do that moving into the future. But yeah, that's where it is right now. So
you touched on something that I was going to ask in a minute when you said Volume 1 of Wasted Lands, right? So you're releasing this product as a 2-volume set, right? So could you... I know the answer to this, but other people don't, and I'd rather you say it than me. Could you describe what the volumes are and how they can be used in different ways by different
Sure.
players, different gamers.
So it was originally intended to be a single volume game, like Night Shift Veterans of the Supernatural Wars is. It just got too big. It would have been like a 400-page tome that would have just been unwieldy at the table. So it's being split in half, and the first volume is going to be the Wasted Lands: The Dreaming Age role-playing game. And it's all the rules to play. Character creation, combat, the whole 9 yards, as well as appendices for optional rules and how to do traditional fantasy and all of that good stuff. Volume 2 then is going to be the Gazetteer and Campaign Guide, and that will have all of the information on the Wasted Lands setting, or the Dreaming Age setting. Wasted Lands: The Dreaming Age. The setting is called the Dreaming Age. It'll have the full Gazetteer. It'll have a section on how to run and play in a Dreaming Age setting or campaign. And we'll have a full bestiary. When I say full, I don't mean we're never going to follow it up. We do actually have plans to actually do a monster book in the future for the O.G.R.E.S system. But it has an expansive bestiary in it. So it's going to be the bestiary, the Gazetteer of the Dreaming Age, and an overview of the world, a campaign guide that tells you how to play in a campaign and gives advice for the GM, how to craft stories, how to engage players with mythology, that whole thing. So yeah, basically the two books are the RPG and the setting book.
Now, I know that and we talked about this earlier, that you're inspired by many of the writings in what's called Appendix N, but I don't expect everybody who likes your game to go out, hunt for either on DriveThruRPG the PDF or on eBay an overpriced copy of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Will you be providing kind of an equivalent of inspirational readings?
Yes, there is a recommended reading list in there, and it includes books on mythology, books on some ancient world cultures. It includes fiction. Obviously Robert E. Howard is listed in there. H.P. Lovecraft is listed in there. It includes some gaming resources in there. Trollord Games has a series of books that they call the Codices, which is like the Codex Egyptian, the Codex Celtarum, the Codex Germania. All of those books are listed in there because, quite frankly, I write for Trollord Games, so I kind of want to give them a shout out. But those books are also some of the best mythological-based gaming resources you can possibly get your hands on. So yeah, they're all listed in there as well.
I was going to say those are pretty prized. They're not in my bookshelf in here because that's for lightweight box sets, but they're in the library outside the room because they just are must-haves. They're like the GURPS books were in the 1990s, in my opinion, as far as their utility for whatever you're running.
And when you're trying to build a game like Wasted Lands that's built around, I don't expect, or I would be disappointed if people were going in and actually running through, say, the Greek or Norse myths exactly as they were told. That's not the point. The idea is, I use an example in the campaign guide. There's a famous story in Norse mythology of Thor's hammer getting stolen by the giants, and the giants are holding it for ransom, and they demand that Freya come and marry the king of the giants to give Thor's hammer back. And Loki comes up with a scheme to dress Thor up in drag and go pretend that he's Freya and get his hammer back. Thor ends up drinking and eating everything in sight and then killing all the giants with Mjolnir when he gets it back. In Wasted Lands, your characters might get called before the king of Hyperborea, who tells you that some weapon that holds special significance to the kingdom has been stolen, and he needs you to go get it back for him, and you have to use subterfuge and trickery to go get the weapon back. That might be the version that you tell, and then through what I call the greatest game of telephone in the history of the world, millions of years later, that has changed and twisted and developed into this story of Thor and Loki going to get Thor's hammer back. That's how the Dreaming Age is intended to be used. Now, again, once it hits your table, what I intended when I wrote it does not matter at all. It's your game, and if you want to play out those stories exactly as they were written, have at it, as long as you're having a good time. But yeah, that's the idea, is to take these inspiration from these mythological stories and then use that inspiration to build your own versions so that these human characters and their legendary exploits become.
Yeah, and what I love about the Norse myths, and other myths too, but in particular I'm thinking of the Norse myths here, is when you start reading the Eddas and things like that, they begin to refer to Odin as if he's the founder of lines of rulership that are alive today. So there's the implication, and this ties
And
in
yet
really
he
well
has a
with
father
Peter
and a
Setting.
grandfather. So,
Right, yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, so it there's that element that I think makes it a perfect fit for that combination of mythopoesis, where you're creating like the myths, right? The legends of heroes get to epic proportions, whether it's the Iliad, right, where maybe in reality the guy who Achilles is based on just got mad one day and just stomped around in the river just because he was angry. But in the Iliad, it's literally he's fighting the river Scamander for a period of time, right? So
yeah, there's so much room all over
have
world mythology to play. I mean, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. There's so much room in that story, with their wrestling and their, it just, you can pick a myth cycle from anywhere in the world. And the great thing about these stories is that people are, I think, justifiably worried in some ways about cultural appropriation these days. But a lot of the themes in these myth stories are universal, and they can be, the themes and ideas behind them can be used to tell stories that are anybody can relate to, that are universally relatable.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really like about the older pulp fiction, whether it's Robert Howard, and I know that he also wrote some excellent historical fiction, but in his fantasy, for lack of a better word, other than sword and sorcery, the term that Fritz Leiber came up with, that you have, and Fritz Leiber did this too, that in these older versions of fantasy tales, they just took like our world, messed around with it a little bit, turned it into a primordial world that is like an version of, like, you have the Sumerians, right, who are Picts. You have the,
I would argue
the
that
name
the Picts are
escaping me?
Picts. The Sumerians are
That's true.
Celts. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. That's the better distinction. Yeah, but right. But you have all of the different types there, and even for somebody as creative as, say, Edgar Rice Burroughs, they all were just pulling off of the things that we already knew to make a fantasy world that was plausible, but not something that they did like Tolkien, where they spent 10 or 15 years creating a unique individual world from scratch that was a new thing. And that kind of creativity or active creation can be intimidating to new game masters.
It can very much. And I think really the idea of familiarity is important. It's vitally important. Even Tolkien drew from the world around him. I mean, the Rohirrim are Vikings. They're Vikings on horseback. The elves, all of Middle-earth is extremely deliberately Eurocentric. But I think that familiarity is important. I think write what you know is important. And I don't know that we have much of a choice but to draw upon our world cultures and our world history and our world mythologies to create something new out of them. I would be hard-pressed to think of any writer who's ever done something that is so unique as to not draw any parallels, because that would just seem utterly alien. I use what I call, I've been calling them proto-cultures, is what I call, and I use it as a shorthand in the Gazetteer, but then I go on to outline, because my cultures, they're not really based on any real world cultures. I'm kind of making them up as I go, because the idea is that these are proto-people who moved into buildings and cities that were already there and are trying to make their mark on the world. But you need a benchmark in your brain so that you can see things. So when I say that Chem, for example, is Proto-Egypt, in your mind, you immediately know what you think of when you think of ancient Egypt. So it's really kind of a visual benchmark more than anything else. And then I give you the while it looks like, so there's pyramids and there's columns, this is actually how the culture itself works, and it may not be anything like ancient Egypt at all, you know.
But I think tools like that and settings like that are really helpful, as I say, to newer gamers entering into the hobby. One of the things that's talked about all the time, right, is the dearth of DMs, and that's really always been a problem. And we have more players now, so maybe it's a bigger problem because there are more players. But the number of people who are willing to make that attempt to go from being a player in a weekly game to running a game as a DM or GM has always been low, and the root cause is almost always the same. I don't feel that I know enough to do it. I'm not creative enough or whatever. And they'll see things like the Forgotten Realms, let's say, or Greyhawk that are fully developed, or other worlds too. Maybe they'll even be fans of Critical Role, which is a highly crafted world by people who work in the entertainment industry, and they'll be like, I can't do that. Well, I think what doing things like with these protocultures shows is that you can take a launching pad and you can go from there to do whatever you want. In my games, I remember it was like, okay, you're in not medieval France. And that's what we called it for a couple months before it got its own name as a kingdom. But I think that's really useful.
And I think in a lot of ways, the prevalence now of these live streamed actual play, like Critical Role, like other ones, they are highly entertaining, and they're popular for very good reason. In some ways, they're harmful because of the fact that younger players watch these games and think, I'm not even going to try to run a game because I can't do that. You don't have to. Your game should not look like Critical Role. The only game that should look like Critical Role is Critical Role. Your game should look like your game. And you're going to stumble at first, and you're going to make mistakes. If you're playing with friends, they're going to roll with you. They're going to help you along. If you're not playing with friends, try and find some friends to play with, or become closer friends with the people that you do play with. But in the end, if you have good players, they're going to support you as a new game master, I think. And that's the key. I think there's this kind of strange competition online a lot of times as to whether it's the player's game or the GM's game, or whether the GM, it's a crime for the GM to have a plot and they should just sit there and passively react to whatever the players do. And it's a collaboration. Every game is a collaboration between the players and the GM. If you don't have that collaboration, that's the only way your table is going to fall apart, if there's no collaboration there. So I think it just takes a little bit of bravery and a little bit of willingness to dive in and give it a go. Your first couple sessions might suck, but they're going to get better. They're going to get better, and people are going to have fun exploring what you're trying to do. And before you know it, you're just going to fall in love with being a game master.
Yeah, I mean, my first sessions, I remember when I first ran in middle school, they were really terrible. They literally were me, like, turning to random pages in the monster manual saying, oh, this is who you're fighting.
I remember those days, yeah.
No, and we still had a great time, and we got better at what we were doing. We incorporated more storytelling and things like that as we moved forward. But, I still remember when one of my dear friends, Sean, first ran Keep on the Borderlands for us. What we did is we attacked the keep. I mean, that's, we were novice gamers too. We're just like, right, this is D&D. You raid and loot and pillage.
I remember being in junior high, and we played Heroes Unlimited from Palladium, and we so badly did not get what it meant to be superheroes. Like, we would stumble upon bad guys robbing a bank, and we would kill the bad guys and then rob the bank. And somewhere along the line, I think it was actually me that realized it when it was my turn to run. that this isn't how superheroes act. So I created
Right.
this sort of ninja master character. We were in, middle school. So I created this ninja master sort of character that showed up and beat the living crap out of all of the players, and then trained them to be proper heroes. And that was kind of the germination of, like, we were starting to get the idea of where this is supposed to go.
And for me, it was superhero role playing games too. Although we didn't end up committing any crimes as superheroes, but it really forced me to think about role playing in a different way. And I know, like, I still have a great love of superhero role playing games. My last video was about them, and there was a time, no longer, because there are far more superhero role playing games out there than I could ever own. But there was a time when I owned every superhero game
Yeah.
manufactured. And I still do, I guess, up to a certain year. So if you go up to like 2005, I'm at 100%. But if you get beyond that, and there's a lot of creative work out there going into this. Now, we've talked in broad strokes about some of the things dealing with your upcoming Kickstarter, what the setting is, the mechanics of the game, and things like that. But let's get a little bit into the nuts and bolts. And what are the tiers? How much is it going to cost me, because I'm totally backing the project? And what are potentially some of the stretch goals that we might see on this project?
Because this is being released in 2 volumes, and I plan to have, it's going to be, the basic funding is going to be for a black and white book. One of the stretch goals higher up is to print in full color, but it is going to have color end pages with the world map in them, and I'm going to have a fold-out poster map of the book included in volume 2. So all of that means it's not going to be cheap to print. So we're looking at, let me actually bring up my Kickstarter here so I can be accurate about this. The kind of sweet spot for the game is a $90 pledge level. You're getting the core rules and the gazetteer in hardcover format, plus digital PDFs of both books. You're going to get a PDF of GM screen inserts and a download code for at-cost print versions of the inserts. And then, of course, you get the poster map and all that good stuff. That's the retail value is expected to be between $125 and $130 for that level. If we make, I have an actual GM screen pledge level. If we make it there, the physical print GM screens will be added into that level. So you'll get, instead of it, well, in addition to your download codes and whatnot, you'll get an actual physical copy of the GM screens as well. So for $90, you're getting both books in hardcover and PDF, PDFs of the GM screens, color print versions of the GM screen inserts, and if we make it there, a full GM screen. So that's for the whole package. You can also buy just Volume 1 or just Volume 2 if you want. Those are $45 for print and digital each. There's PDF, much less costly PDF only versions of the game. There's going to be collector's leather editions of the game. To get just the RPG in a leather edition is going to be $125, and then you also get the normal version of the game in print as well, and PDFs. And then there is the complete game in all-in collector's leather edition, and that gives you leather versions of both volumes with the actual printed, the regular print editions and the leather versions, as well as the GM screen stuff all in one. So that's a $275 one. And I threw in there just for fun. I don't know that anybody's actually going to pledge it. There's a $1,000 pledge level that I will run an online game for the people that pledge it with you, which is kind of a unique thing because I absolutely hate online gaming. So that's probably your one chance to actually get in and have me run a game online. But I put that in there kind of as a lark just for fun to throw it out there. So now stretch goals, we have the first one is the Siege Engine conversion for Trollord Games that I talked about. The second one is an increased art budget. The third one is physical GM screens. The fourth one is actually to print slipcases to put the games in. From there is full color printing. And right now the top one, and I am not promising that this is going to stay because my original programmer was not able to do it, so I'm kind of looking for somebody else that can handle it for me. I've talked to a friend of mine. I want to get Foundry virtual tabletop support in play for it. That's a factor of whether or not my contact can actually do it for me. So if not, I'll come up with something else very cool for the $40,000. I do want to do virtual tabletop support for O.G.R.E.S at some point in time. It's just a factor of finding the money to pay a good programmer to put it together. So, so that's the pledge levels and that's the stretch goals. The basic funding for this is going to be $18,000 to get it actually printed.
I always think it's interesting when people have Kickstarters or whatever, and let's say you were to make $100,000 on the Kickstarter or more, and then people will think you're making $100,000, but that's not the case. Not only do you have to pay 10% to Kickstarter, the company, just for letting you host it, but then you have your production costs and you have all of the costs that go in. So, often even some of the pretty large Kickstarters end up either having a very low profit margin or breaking even.
There's been people who've had $1 million Kickstarters that ended up going bankrupt because they didn't properly think about what it was going to cost them to produce and ship all of that swag that they offered for stretch goals. I try to keep my stretch goals manageable and directly related to the game so that you are guaranteed I'm going to deliver when this is done. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's rare beyond rare for somebody to make a super profit off of a Kickstarter campaign. The goal is to get the game funded and get it out there so I can start selling it to the public. Not to mention, you have to pay income tax on whatever you don't spend, put back into the company. So.
I am always in awe when people have a Kickstarter ending in like mid-December, and I'm like, you do have a plan to like spend all of the money that you're getting, right?
Time,
because otherwise, well, because if you get your money, let's say December 20th, just making up a date there, and you don't spend it by December 31st, that's revenue for that year, and that's profit for that year. And maybe you're running a loss for the next year or whatever, but you want to try and avoid that. And I don't mind, and I see this a lot. I see the Kickstarters that are what I call Gen Con feeders, right? That maybe they come out in January, February. They're pretty far down the pipeline by a company or whatever, and they're doing the Kickstarter so that they can do the print run to do at Gen Con or another convention. And that makes perfect sense to me, and it shows kind of a planning to me, looking ahead. But the people who are like, I'm going to get it in at the end of the year, I'm always like, it's not impossible to spend that money instantly if you've got your printer lined up and everything. You can prepay things like that, but and if you already owe artists money and things like that, you can pay them back. But I think enough people potentially have been burned on the artist front that maybe it's harder to get people to write gratis on the hopes of getting funding when the
when
game.
I first started doing this in 99, 2000, it was very standard to sign a contract that was payment 90 days after publication. Nobody is willing to do that anymore. It's at best 90 days after you accept the manuscript now, and that's great, and it's totally understandable, and I kind of wish things had been that way when I first started freelancing, because it would have saved me some trouble back in the day. But it's changed the economics. Kickstarter has changed the economics of things. When I did Night Shift, it was, just like you're talking about, we did the Kickstarter in October, and it was tight getting the expenses out before we hit tax time. That was a lesson learned. We thought Night Shift, we did it in October because we thought it would be fun to do it for Halloween. I probably should have done it earlier for a Halloween release. So
maybe taking advantage of the fact that grocery stores at the end of August already have Halloween displays, right? And the Christmas display goes up the week before Halloween.
This one, my expected delivery date for Wasted Lands is November. My hope is to have it out time in October, but I like to give myself a little cushion. So far, I've been involved with a ton of Kickstarters for Troll Lord, but I've done 2 for Elflair Games.
Right.
Both have delivered on time or within a month or 2 of the projected release date. So I have a good track record there.
I was really impressed with the delivery on Night Shift, and I'm not taking it off the shelf to open it up and show everybody, but it is a well-constructed book, and it holds up well and is beautiful to use and stuff. And the O.G.R.E.S system is a fun system to do. I've only played Night Shift in a couple of one-shots since our regular game is, I imagine, 95% of gamers right now, a 5th edition game that I run for my daughters and their friends. But at least they're up for every now and then playing something else and having a little bit of fun on those kinds of things. But it's good to have that kind of delivery, especially with, I'm not somebody who has this mentality, but a lot of people who back Kickstarters have the mentality that they're doing a pre-order instead of supporting what I'll call like an entrepreneurial effort. I think that covers about everything that we need to cover. I hear voices in the background. So I want to thank you for coming on. And definitely this will be out by early next week. So we'll get this on the air. But thanks again for being here. And I hope we can chat again in the future when the Kickstarter is successful.
Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Jason Vey about his role-playing game Wasted Lands. It's an upcoming Kickstarter, so please make sure to stop by. If you like this content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I can use all the audience I can get. And if you have any ideas for any future topics that you'd like to see or people you'd like to see me interview, please leave a comment. Thanks, and have a great day.
Shall we play a game?
This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange Game, the only winning movie.